Hello dear learners, I am Dr. Sucheta Shankar V, Assistant Professor, Department of English, Srinarayana Guru Open University. Welcome to our continued exploration of B21EG01DC, Introduction to Literature. Today, we are going to look at Block 3, Unit 2. And in Unit 2, we are going to look at the Victorian era. Surely, you're familiar with the phrase, the empire on which the sun never sets. These words are often used to refer to the British Empire during the rule of Queen Victoria. The Victorian age in literature, which we are going to explore now from 1837 to 1901, is named after her. It was a time of great prosperity and reform in Britain, which emerged as a colonial power with territories all over the world, including in India. The Industrial Revolution of the previous years had transformed the economy of the country. British goods and commerce became dominant everywhere. This increased the country's global influence and colonial superiority. The richness of the age encouraged scientific and medical advancements. Technological innovations such as the steam engine and electricity entirely transformed the life of the masses. Democratic reforms such as universal voting rights and protection for workers' rights were also established in Britain during this time. The radical changes of the period were beginning to affect the literature of the period as well. This was largely due to three factors. The first was that the advancements in printing technology increased access to books and magazines in British society. Secondly, the newly emerged middle class, who emerged as part of the Industrial Revolution, had higher rates of literacy and certainly had more leisure time to pursue reading as a hobby. Thirdly, this newly emerged middle class readership actually did not want education from the books alone. They wanted reading to be an entertainment as well. As a result, the writers of the Victorian age had to meet the demands of this new readership. This caused shifts in style from the earlier Romantic age. There was a rejection of emotion, imagination, and self-expression, which were considered to be romantic ideals. Victorians emphasized a scientific or empirical worldview, and certainly they considered prose writing as more suitable for this purpose. It's for this reason that the Victorian period became known as the Age of Prose. When we think about the age, its spirit is one where both progress and traditions were upheld. In fact, the various artists and writers of this age have varying attitudes to the same. While an earlier set of writers from the late 1830s to the 1870s retained faith in the scientific and social progress of the period, later Victorian authors from the 1870s to the 1900s had an attitude of doubt and questioning and pessimism. This can actually be seen in the different approaches taken up by the representative writers of the age. Another important dimension of Victorian society during this period was the class structure. There were questions about how class privilege and social hierarchy would work in society. Further, this age also saw a questioning of the view of gender, that is, the social role of women. Women were not considered to be socially equal to men during this time. They were often reduced to domestic roles and celebrated as mothers and wives. Good marriages, housekeeping, and the bringing up of children were considered to be their primary responsibilities. The literature of the age reflects these values in certain ways. For example, Coventry Patmore's long narrative poem, The Angel in the House, describes the qualities of an ideal wife during the Victorian era. She is presented as self-sacrificing, gentle, and submissive. Her attention is entirely on the home, husband, and children, excluding the larger world outside. Keeping in mind this socio-cultural backdrop in which Victorian literature emerged, let's look at its different features. The first and foremost feature that we can find in Victorian literature is its moral purpose. Even though there was a new readership that looked for entertainment in literature, the overall aspect of Victorian literature contained an emphasis on morality. Moral education for the readers was considered to be very important because of the social and religious controversies of the time. Further, Victorian writers also wanted to move away from the romantic way of simply delighting the audience. Victorian literature also showed a focus on practical aspects of life. Think back to Charles Dickens' novel Oliver Twist, where the young Oliver is orphaned and put up in a poorhouse. That famous scene when a hungry Oliver goes up to the master of the house and asks for more soup simply because he is hungry. In that scene, he is beaten and scolded just for the act of asking for more food. This represents the Victorian focus on practical problems and interests of life. They prominently represented experiences of industrialization, poverty, class division, women's rights, and other social issues. There was a shift away from the philosophical focus of Romanticism. We can see this shift in the Victorian novel, which can be considered social fiction. There was a focus on issues related to industrialization and the condition of the nation. Social problems were highlighted in the plots. In fact, certain writers, such as Mrs. Trollope and Benjamin Disraeli, were considered writers of social fiction. Of course, the novels of Charles Dickens too fall under this category. Another aspect of Victorian literature is its emphasis on realism. The Victorian novelist George Eliot, also known as Mary Ann Evans, would often present her characters with their imperfections and flaws. She considered that there is greater literary value in reflecting the world around and not idealizing it. This attempt is found in Victorian literature in general. They rejected the idealization or over-dramatization. They rejected the idealization or over-dramatization of people, events, or philosophies. Rather, there was an attempt at mirroring the world as it is. Another important aspect that characterized or colored Victorian literature is its crisis of faith. In the poem Dover Beach, written by Matthew Arnold, the sea of faith is depicted as slowly withdrawing with a melancholy long roar. This theme of the decreasing influence of faith and religion is prominent in Victorian literature. It is a reaction to the rising importance of science in society. There was a sense of doubt and pessimism about where the progress of science and technology would eventually take humankind. Of course, one cannot talk about the Victorian age without talking about the Victorian compromise. It was a period where different ideas and conflicting aspects in society were coming up. On one hand, there was a struggle to maintain religion as scientific advancements mounted and mounted. There was a tendency to strictly follow social and cultural conventions, even as new reforms were being introduced. Similarly, industrialization, which at first seemed to be increasing prosperity, was in fact proven to be increasing social ills at the same time. The literature of the period reflects these contradictions. Certain authors attempted to strike a balance between these forces, and certain others criticized those aspects which they found to be utterly condemnable and considered to be ill in society. So, keeping these features in mind, let's look at the first genre of Victorian literature, which is poetry. Even though prose was considered to be a dominant force during this period, poetry was a significant genre as well. the language of poetry became more purposeful and narrational. Poetry became a way of discussing society and culture and the practical problems that the world around them encountered. There was a preference for intellectual subject matter. The major poets of this period highlighted this spirit of Victorian poetry. So we may find this reflected in the poetry of Lord Alfred Tennyson, Matthew Arnold, and Robert Browning. There were, of course, certain minor poets such as Elizabeth Barrett Browning and Arthur Hugh Clough, in whose poetry also we may find certain of these features reflected. Another parallel school of poetry that existed during that time was known as the Pre-Raphaelite school. Now, this was a group of artists and writers who revolted against the principles of the Victorian era. They believed in simplicity and accuracy of detail, and their works were modeled after medieval literature and art. Their focus was on realistic, sensual depictions, which gave them the nickname fleshly school of poetry. The major poets of the Pre-Raphaelite school are Dante Gabriel Rossetti, Christina Rossetti, William Morris, and A.C. Swinburne. Of course, during this time, the novel emerged as a literary form for discussing the issues of the time. Novel reading became accepted as a tasteful hobby for the upper and middle class societies. Now, this is where there is that balance between the novel as a form of entertainment and the novel as a form of moral education. There was indeed an emphasis on morals and correctness. Novels dealt with questions of respectability, marriage, class, social status, and decorum. We could indeed say that the novel became a form of national literature during this period. Another important aspect of the Victorian novel is that many of them were published first in a serialized form in magazines and pamphlets. This meant that there would be a brief lapse between the publication of different chapters. So, in order to keep the readers attracted to the novel, writers would end chapters in a mystery. This would ensure that the readers would buy the next issue of the magazine or pamphlet to complete the story. This age saw the emergence of three brilliant novelists, Charles Dickens, William Thackeray, and George Eliot. Each of them contributed in their own way to the legacy of Victorian literature. There were, of course, later novelists during this period who are equally important, such as Thomas Hardy, Bronte sisters, Wilkie Collins, Rudyard Kipling, and Robert Louis Stevenson, who each carved a niche for themselves in Victorian literature. There was a great shift in the field of drama as well. From the sentimental and romantic styles of the previous era, drama became a realistic art. Further, the Victorian middle classes took to the theatre as a form of entertainment. The most important dramatists of this period were Oscar Wilde, Irving Pinero, A.C. Swinburne, Robert Browning, as well as George Bernard Shaw, whose early plays appeared during the Victorian era. The most important prose writers of this period were Thomas Carlyle, John Ruskin, Lord Thomas Babington Macaulay, and Matthew Arnold. With this, we have come to an end of our exploration of Unit 2, the Victorian period. Here, we've looked at the historical and social backdrop of Victorian literature. We've explored the different features and characteristics, as well as we've gained an insight into the various writers of different genres of the Victorian era. Let us meet again exploring another unit in this chapter.